They spent their lives being chased by linebackers, by deadlines, by expectations. On Sundays, they were untouchable, armored, protected, cheered by tens of thousands of people who believed nothing could bring them down. But some of the deadliest moments of an NFL player's life happen far away from the stadium. No pads, no whistle, no teammates to pick them back up. They happen on a quiet stretch of highway, on a back road at 2 in the morning, on a motorcycle, in the dark, on a road they had driven 100 times before. This is the story of the men who survived the NFL and didn't survive getting home. Somewhere in this country right now, there's a game jersey folded in a closet that nobody has the heart to give away. There's a trophy case with a photograph next to it instead of a person. There's a childhood bedroom that hasn't changed in years, because changing it would feel like letting go one more time. That's what these stories really are. Underneath the box scores and the highlight reels, they're homes that are missing someone permanently and families who had to learn how to keep living anyway. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Zone, where every case matters, every victim is remembered, and every story deserves to be told. It costs nothing, and it tells us you want more stories like this one told with the care they deserve. These are their stories. Lewis Billups. There's a particular kind of grief reserved for athletes who peak, fade from the spotlight, and are still trying to figure out life after football when tragedy strikes. Lewis Billups knew that in-between space well. In the mid to late 1980s, Billups was one of the most physical cornerbacks in the NFL, a key piece of a Cincinnati Bengals defense that helped carry the franchise to Super Bowl 23. He wasn't the biggest name on that roster, but he was one of the toughest, willing to throw his body into much larger receivers without a moment's hesitation. Teammates respected him because he never took a playoff, never looked for an easy way out of a collision. By 1994, Billups was 29 years old, several years removed from the league, still carrying that same fearless energy into his everyday life. On the night of his death, he lost control of his Corvette at speeds reportedly exceeding 100 miles per hour. The crash killed him instantly, and it killed a passenger riding with him too. Someone else's son, someone else's friend, another name added to a night that should have ended with everyone getting home safely. For those who remembered Billups from his playing days, the way he died carried an almost unbearable irony. The same fearlessness that made him a respected, physical defender, the willingness to go all in without flinching, seemed to follow him off the field, behind the wheel, at a speed that left no room for a second chance. His former teammates, when asked about him years later, don't talk about statistics. They talk about a guy who would have done anything for the man next to him in the huddle. They talk about someone who deserved a longer life than the one he got, and a passenger who deserved to make it home that night too. Billups had already lived through the hardest transition. An athlete faces the one nobody prepares you for, the one that happens the day after your career ends, and the cheering stops for good. Life after football is its own kind of collision, a sudden loss of identity that countless former players describe as harder than anything they ever faced on the field. Billups was still navigating that transition when his life ended, still figuring out who he was outside of a helmet and shoulder pads. He never got the chance to finish figuring it out. And somewhere, a family that had already watched him fight so hard to make it to the NFL had to bury him before he ever got to build whatever came next. Next, Andy Spiva. Not every story in this video belongs to a household name, and that doesn't make the grief attached to it any smaller. In fact, sometimes it makes it heavier, because these are the stories the world never got to hear. Andy Spiva was only 24 years old in 1979. He hadn't built a decade-long career. He hadn't reached a Super Bowl. He was simply a young man chasing the same dream that every player on this list once chased, the dream of making it, of hearing his name called, of building a life around the game he loved. That dream ended on a Georgia road, in a car accident that also left his teammate Garth Ten Napel with serious injuries. Ten Napel survived. Spiva did not. Try to imagine what that moment was like for Ten Napel waking up in a hospital bed, injured, disoriented, and being told that the friend who had been sitting beside him only moments earlier was gone. That is a weight very few people ever have to carry, and it's one that doesn't heal on any predictable timeline. Survivor's guilt is rarely talked about in these stories, but it is real, and it is often just as devastating as the loss itself. Spiva's family never got to watch him build the career he was working toward. His teammates never got to see the player he might have become. All that's left is a name, an age far too young, and a reminder that these tragedies don't only take the stars, they take the ones who were just getting started too. Think about what a 4-year-old football player's life actually looks like. He's probably still calling his parents every week to update them on how camp is going. He's probably still got a bedroom back home with old trophies on the shelf. He's still young enough to believe the best years are ahead of him, not behind him. That's the version of Andy Spiva that was taken from the world in 1979, not a finished story, but a story that had barely started being written. And for Ten Nepal, the friend who survived that same crash, every year that passed afterward was a year Spiva never got. That's a specific, quiet kind of grief that doesn't show up in any box score, and it's one that likely never fully left him. Next, Rusty Chambers. Some of the men on this list built their entire NFL careers through sheer will. Rusty Chambers was one of them. He wasn't handed a roster spot, he earned it, fighting through the kind of physical grind at linebacker that breaks most men before they ever see the field on Sundays. By 1981, Chambers had already stepped away from professional football, moving into the next chapter of his life the way so many former players do quietly, without headlines, simply trying to build something new. He was only 27 years old when he was killed in an automobile crash. There were no national broadcasts dedicated to his death, no highlight packages played on a loop, but somewhere, a mother lost her son. Somewhere, teammates who had once trusted him to fill a gap in the defense heard the news and sat in stunned silence. Somewhere, a family had to figure out how to keep living in a world that no longer had him in it. Chambers' story is a reminder that grief doesn't require a national spotlight to be real. For every headline-grabbing tragedy on this list, there are stories like his quieter, but just as devastating to the people who loved him. It's worth sitting with the fact that not every athlete who dies too young gets a wave of national tributes, a moment of silence before kickoff, or a heartfelt statement from a franchise's official social media account. Some of them simply disappear from the public record, remembered only in local newspaper clippings and family photo albums. Rusty Chambers earned an NFL roster spot through pure grit, in an era when the league offered far less financial security and far less protection than it does today. He gave years of his life to a violent sport, survived it, and still didn't get the chance to grow old. That's a story that deserves to be told just as loudly as any of the others on this list, even decades later. Next, Rob Bironas. Ask any Tennessee Titans fan from the 2000s who Rob Bironas was, and you won't just get a name, you'll get a story. Maybe it's the night he kicked 8 field goals in a single game, an NFL record that still stands today. Maybe it's a specific fourth quarter kick that sent an entire stadium into a frenzy. For a decade, Bironas wasn't just a kicker for the Titans. He was the guy Nashville trusted when a game came down to the final seconds. Bironas spent 10 years with the franchise, becoming one of the most beloved specialists in team history, the kind of player fans build genuine affection for, not because of flash, but because of consistency, clutch performances, and the sense that he would always come through when it mattered most. On the 20th of September 2014, Bironas was driving in Nashville, the city that had chanted his name for a decade, when he lost control of his SUV, reportedly traveling at a high rate of speed. The vehicle struck trees and a culvert. He was 36 years old. The news hit Nashville like a gut punch. This wasn't a player fans had watched from a distance for 1 or 2 seasons. This was someone who had become part of the emotional fabric of the city, someone whose right leg had decided the outcome of games people still talk about at bars and tailgates today. Former teammates described him as a family man, someone who lit up a locker room, someone whose death felt impossible to reconcile with the guy they knew. For a franchise and a fan base that had cheered his name through some of the loudest moments in their stadium's history, his death was a devastating reminder that the men behind the jerseys are just as fragile, just as mortal, as anyone else walking off a Nashville street that night. There's something almost unbearable about the fact that Barones built a career on precision, on being the one player teams trusted to deliver exactly when it mattered most, under exactly the right conditions, with exactly the right amount of composure. He spent a decade proving he could be counted on in the most pressure-filled seconds of a football game. And then, in an instant that had nothing to do with pressure or performance, all of that precision and control was gone. His wife and children lost a husband and a father. A city that had chanted his name during some of its most electric moments had to learn to remember him only in replays. Nashville still talks about that 8-field goal night as one of the greatest individual performances in franchise history. They shouldn't have had to start talking about him in the past tense so soon after. Next, Cedric Benson. Cedric Benson's career was built on persistence. Drafted 4th overall by the Chicago Bears out of Texas, Benson arrived in the NFL under the weight of enormous expectations. His early years in Chicago were turbulent, filled with the kind of criticism that ends careers before they ever really begin. But Benson didn't let it end his career. He found a second life in Cincinnati, becoming one of the league's most durable and productive running backs for several seasons, grinding out yards the hard way, year after year, refusing to be defined by his rocky start. After retiring, Benson stayed active, the way many former athletes do, chasing that same adrenaline, that same sense of freedom, in new ways. For Benson, that meant motorcycles. On the 17th of August 2019, Benson was riding in Austin, Texas when he collided with a minivan. He was 36 years old. Think about what that means. A man who spent an entire decade absorbing full-speed hits from some of the most physically dominant defenders in professional sports. A man whose body had been trained, conditioned, and tested against the most punishing position in football survived all of it. He got through the injuries, the tacklers, the pile-ups. And then he lost his life doing something he loved on an open road in a collision that had nothing to do with the sport that made him famous. His former teammates remembered him as relentless, a back who never went down on first contact, who fought for every extra yard even when the play was already dead. That same relentlessness defined how people spoke about him after his death, a man who never stopped moving forward right up until the very end. Benson's death struck a particular nerve across the football world because of the timing of his career. He had walked away from a sport that statistically shortens life expectancy and increases the risk of long-term brain injury, and he had made it out with his health, his name, and his legacy intact. Fans who had once booed him during his rocky rookie seasons in Chicago had, by the time of his death, come around to appreciating just how hard he had fought to rebuild his reputation and his career in Cincinnati. He had already written his redemption story. He was still living it when it was cut short. His family was left to grieve a man who had already overcome so much, only to lose him to something that had nothing to do with the sport that once threatened to define him unfairly. Next, Tarvaris Jackson. Tarvaris Jackson's NFL career spanned more than a decade, starting as the starting quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings before transitioning into a backup and mentorship role with the Seattle Seahawks, where he became part of a Super Bowl winning organization. But if you ask former teammates what they remember most about Jackson, it's rarely about stat lines. It's about who he was in the quarterback room. Jackson was known as a quiet leader, someone who put in the work without needing credit for it, someone who took younger quarterbacks under his wing and helped them prepare for moments he himself had already lived through. In a league full of egos, Jackson's teammates often described him as one of the most selfless players they had ever shared a locker room with. On the 12th of April 2020, Jackson was killed when his vehicle crashed into a tree in Alabama, his home state, the place he had come from, the place he was going back to. His death landed at one of the strangest, most disorienting moments in recent memory. The world was only weeks into the COVID-19 pandemic. Football facilities were closed. Teammates couldn't gather in person to grieve together. Vigils that would have normally brought hundreds of people together had to happen over phone calls and social media posts instead. For many who knew him, that isolation made the loss even harder to process, grieving a friend, while the entire world outside their window had gone eerily silent. Russell Wilson, his former teammate in Seattle, spoke about Jackson's quiet mentorship publicly after his death, describing him as a steady, selfless presence who helped shape him as a young quarterback. It was a tribute that captured what so many others felt, but struggled to put into words, that Jackson's impact wasn't measured in touchdowns. It was measured in the players he made better simply by being in the room with them. Jackson was a father. He left behind children who will grow up hearing about their dad's NFL career from other people, piecing together who he was through old game footage and secondhand stories instead of his own voice telling it to them. There's a particular kind of heartbreak in that a child asking, "What was my dad like?" and having to rely on teammates, coaches, and old interviews to answer a question that should have been answered by bedtime stories and Sunday afternoons instead. Jackson gave so much of himself to mentoring other people's futures. His own family had to find a way to keep his memory alive for the people who needed him most. Next, David Patten. David Patten's story is the kind that gets told to kids who are being cut from teams and told they'll never make it. Undrafted out of a small college, Patten had every reason to walk away from football early. Instead, he fought his way onto NFL rosters, eventually becoming a key wide receiver for the New England Patriots dynasty of the early 2000s, a dynasty that won 3 Super Bowl titles with him on the roster. Patten's game day heroics became the stuff of legend, including a performance where he caught 4 touchdown passes in a single game, a feat that still gets brought up when fans discuss the greatest receiving performances in franchise history. He was known around the league as one of the most reliable, sure-handed possession receivers of his era, the kind of teammate a quarterback trusted in the biggest moments. On the 8th of December 2021, Patten was riding his motorcycle in South Carolina when he was killed in a crash. He was 47 years old. For Patriots fans, the loss hit with a particular kind of heaviness. Patten belonged to one of the most celebrated eras in NFL history, a dynasty whose championship runs are still replayed, dissected, and celebrated on television decades later. Losing one of the men who helped build that legacy nearly 2 decades after his final championship was a painful reminder that even the players immortalized in highlight reels are not immune to the fragility of everyday life. Former teammates remembered him not for the touchdowns, but for his humility, a man who never let 3 championship rings change who he was off the field. Friends described him as someone who still showed up for old teammates, still answered the phone, still made time for the people who knew him before he was a Super Bowl champion. Patten's path to the NFL is exactly the kind of story that gets told to inspire kids who have every reason to give up. He wasn't a can't-miss prospect. He wasn't drafted. He had to prove, roster spot by roster spot, practice by practice, that he belonged among some of the most talented athletes on the planet. That kind of perseverance shapes a person permanently. It makes them grateful in a way that top draft picks sometimes never have to learn. Those who knew Patten said that gratitude never faded, even after 3 championships. He remained a mentor to young receivers fighting the exact same uphill battle he once faced. Losing him at 47 meant losing a living reminder to an entire generation of undrafted players that the impossible dream really was possible, and a family lost a husband and father who had already given the sport everything he had. Next, Jeff Gladney. There are certain deaths on this list that are almost impossible to sit with because of how much life was still ahead. Jeff Gladney's is one of them. Gladney was a first-round pick of the Minnesota Vikings in 2020, a cornerback with blazing speed, sharp instincts, and the kind of competitive fire that made scouts fall in love with him during the draft process. After his rookie contract, he signed with the Arizona Cardinals, still chasing the next chapter of a career that had barely begun. On the 25th of May 2022, Gladney was killed in a high-speed car crash in Dallas. He was only 25 years old. 25, an age where most people are still figuring out who they want to become. An age where Gladney should have had at least another decade of football ahead of him, another decade of birthdays, another decade of phone calls home to family who had watched him fight his way to the NFL. Instead, his story ended before it ever had the chance to be fully written. Former coaches and teammates described Gladney as fiercely competitive, someone who treated every single practice rep like it was the Super Bowl, someone who refused to accept anything less than his absolute best. That same intensity is what made his death so hard for people around the league to process. He wasn't a player coasting into retirement. He was a player who still had everything to prove, everything to give, and it was taken from him in an instant. Gladney's mother had watched her son fight for everything he ever earned, from youth football fields in Texas all the way to the first round of the NFL draft. That's the kind of journey parents dream about the payoff after years of early morning practices, missed family events, and the constant fear that it might never happen. She got to see her son achieve it. She got to watch him get drafted, sign his name to an NFL contract, and step onto a professional field. And then, only 2 years later, she had to bury him. There is no version of that sequence of events that makes sense to a parent. There is no amount of pride in what he accomplished that erases the unbearable unfairness of losing him so soon after finally watching his dream come true. Next, DJ Hayden. His story begins with a miracle. Before he was ever drafted into the NFL, Hayden survived a horrifying on-campus accident at the University of Houston, an injury so severe that doctors said he came within millimeters of losing his life on the spot. He recovered. He didn't just recover, he went back out and finished his college career, entered the NFL draft, and built an 8-year career as a cornerback for the Oakland Raiders, Detroit Lions, and Jacksonville Jaguars. For years, Hayden's story was told as one of resilience, a young man who cheated death once and turned that second chance into a professional football career most people only dream about. On the 9th of April 2023, Hayden was one of 6 people killed in Houston when another driver allegedly ran a red light, causing a catastrophic collision. He was 33 years old. There's a particular cruelty to how his story ends. He had already survived the unthinkable once, through nothing but sheer will and medical fortune, and had spent every year since as living proof that a second chance could be turned into something extraordinary. To lose his life in a crash he had no part in causing one that also claimed 5 other lives that same day turns his story from one of triumph into one of devastating, senseless loss. 5 other families were living the exact same nightmare that night. 5 other sets of parents, partners and children receiving the exact same kind of phone call. Hayden's former teammates remembered him as someone who never took a single day for granted, a man who understood better than almost anyone in the league just how fragile life truly is. It makes his death even harder to accept. Picture what it must have been like for the people who loved DJ Hayden the first time they got that call, the one where a doctor tells you your son might not survive the night. And then picture the relief, the disbelief, the gratitude when he did survive, when he walked again, played again, made it all the way to the NFL against odds that should have ended his story years earlier. His family had already lived through the worst night of their lives once. They believed, understandably, that the hardest chapter was behind them. To get that same kind of call again, over a decade later, for a crash that had nothing to do with his own decisions, is a cruelty that's difficult to even put into words. 5 other families received that same call, that same night. None of them were prepared for it. None of them ever will be. Next, Kyrie Jackson. Of every story in this video, Kyrie Jackson's might be the hardest one to say out loud. Jackson was a standout defensive back at Oregon, the kind of player whose tape made NFL scouts sit up straighter. He was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings in 2024, still just months away from what should have been the first regular season snap of a promising NFL career. He had the size, the speed, and the ball skills that had teams believing they'd found a genuine long-term piece for their secondary. On the 6th of July 2024, Jackson was killed in Maryland when another driver, later charged with DUI and vehicular manslaughter, struck the vehicle he was riding in. He was only 24 years old. Jackson never got to play a single down in an NFL regular season game. Not one. He had spent his entire life working toward that moment, the years of practices before sunrise, the training camps, the film sessions, the sacrifice. And it was taken from him before he ever got the chance to walk out onto an NFL field on a Sunday afternoon. This wasn't a story about risk-taking or high speeds behind his own wheel. This was a story about a young man doing nothing wrong, going nowhere reckless, and having his entire future stolen by someone else's decision to get behind the wheel impaired. His draft classmates, some of whom had trained alongside him for the NFL Combine only months earlier, were left to process the death of a friend before they had even played their first professional game together. The Vikings organization, still building around the promise of what Jackson could become, had to instead figure out how to grieve a player the world barely got to meet. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a death like this one, the silence of a locker stall that was never filled, a jersey number that never got worn in a real NFL game, a highlight reel that will forever remain empty. Jackson's family had spent years believing the hardest part was already behind them, the grind of youth football, the recruiting process, the draft process, all the obstacles that keep most kids from ever reaching this level. They had made it. He had made it. And then, before the world ever got to see what he could do on Sundays, he was gone, taken by a decision that belonged entirely to someone else. His teammates at Oregon, his new teammates in Minnesota, and his family were left to mourn not just a person, but an entire future that had already been planned out and was never allowed to happen. Next, Jerome Brown. In the early 1990s, if you wanted to understand what made the Philadelphia Eagles defense one of the most feared units in football, you didn't need to look much further than the man lined up at defensive tackle. Jerome Brown wasn't just strong, he was fast, disruptive, and loud in the best possible way. A first-round pick out of Miami, he anchored a defensive line that helped define an era of Eagles football, playing alongside names like Reggie White. Brown was named to back-to-back Pro Bowls. He was, by every measure, just entering the prime of a career that seemed destined for greatness. If you asked anyone who played alongside Jerome Brown what he was like, you wouldn't just hear about his talent, you'd hear about his laugh. Teammates described him as the emotional center of the locker room, loud, magnetic, impossible to ignore, the kind of presence that made a franchise feel like a family instead of a business. He was only 27 years old. On the 25th of June 1992 in Brooksville, Florida, Brown was behind the wheel of his Chevrolet Corvette when he lost control of the vehicle. The car left the road and struck a utility pole. Brown died instantly. In the passenger seat was his 2-year-old nephew, a boy who idolized his uncle, who had likely spent that entire car ride grinning about being close to an NFL star. That boy died too. There is no way to soften what that means. A child who should have had decades of birthdays, first days of school, and family holidays ahead of him was gone in the same instant as his uncle. For Brown's family, the grief wasn't singular, it was doubled, layered, impossible to fully separate. Reggie White, Brown's close friend and defensive line partner, delivered a eulogy that day that reporters described as one of the most emotional moments they had ever witnessed from the normally composed veteran. White would go on to say that losing Brown changed the way he thought about football entirely, that no championship, no contract, no individual accolade was worth as much as the people you shared the journey with. The Eagles organization held a private moment of silence before their next game, but for the players who had shared meeting rooms and practice fields with Brown, no moment of silence was ever going to be long enough. Some described struggling to walk past his old locker for months. Others admitted they still, decades later, think of him whenever they see a yellow Corvette on the highway. The Eagles retired his memory in the way teams often do a moment of silence, a patch on a jersey, a mention in the media guide for years afterward. But those gestures, however well-intentioned, can never capture what his family actually lost. A mother lost a son and a grandson on the same afternoon. Somewhere, there are photographs from that final summer that nobody in that family can look at without their chest tightening. Birthday parties, cookouts, ordinary Tuesday afternoons that suddenly became the last ordinary Tuesday afternoons they would ever share. That is the reality behind every statistic on this list. Real people, real families, permanently altered in the time it takes a car to leave the road. Jerome Brown never got to find out how great he could have become, but everyone who loved him already knew. There's something particularly cruel about a death that takes 2 generations of the same family at once. Brown's nephew wasn't a passing acquaintance along for a ride. He was family, the kind of kid who probably spent that entire summer bragging to his friends about riding shotgun with his NFL uncle. Somewhere, that boy's parents had to bury a child while simultaneously mourning a brother. Somewhere, an entire extended family had to sit in a single room and try to make sense of losing 2 people they loved in the exact same moment, on the exact same afternoon, in the exact same car. Decades later, Eagles fans still bring up Jerome Brown's name with a kind of reverence usually reserved for players who won championships. He never got a Super Bowl ring. He never got a bust in Canton. But ask anyone who watched that Eagles defense terrorize opposing quarterbacks in the early 90s, and they'll tell you Brown was the emotional engine that made the whole thing run. Losing him didn't just cost the Eagles a great player, it cost an entire city a piece of its identity during one of the most exciting eras in franchise history. Every one of these men chased something most people only dream about. They fought through camps, cuts, injuries, and the odds stacked against nearly everyone who ever puts on a helmet just for the chance to play in the NFL. Some of them made it for a single season, others built decade-long careers and even championship rings. But in the end, the very thing that made them extraordinary on Sundays, their speed, their fearlessness, their willingness to push limits, couldn't protect them on an ordinary night, on an ordinary road, doing something as simple as trying to get home. They didn't lose their lives on a football field, in front of cheering crowds and television cameras. They lost them quietly, usually alone or with just 1 or 2 other people nearby, in moments that took seconds to unfold and a lifetime to fully comprehend for the people who loved them. If this video moved you, take a second to think about the families still living with these losses today. Parents who still keep old game tapes, kids who grew up only knowing their father through stories, teammates who still can't drive past a certain stretch of road without thinking about that night. Don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Zone, where every case matters, every victim is remembered, and every story deserves to be told. If there's a player, a case, or a tragedy you think deserves to be covered next, drop it in the comments below. We read every single one, and we tell these stories because these men, and the people who loved them, deserve to be remembered as more than a headline. Thank you for watching, and until next time, drive safe and take care of each other.